Welcome to the Slightly Greener Life podcast. This is your host, Tanya Harris. I am an award-winning environmental toxin expert, best-selling author, and mother of three. I created this podcast as a place to help busy moms ditch the overwhelm and start living a low-toxin life. Now, let's get into this week's episode. Welcome back to another episode of the Slightly Greener Life. I am so glad you're here. And I'm excited to talk about this topic today because I get this question a lot. What is the safest cookware? So today I'll be breaking down my favorites, but there is a lot of info in this episode. So if you're home, maybe settle in with a coffee or a glass of wine, or take me on a walk. I'll tell you more than you ever wanted to know about cookware. But I also have to say that I don't think that there is a perfect non-toxic cookware. There are definitely options that I recommend staying away from if possible. But when it comes to safer cookware, you'll see that having a couple of different types on hand is ideal. When it comes to choosing cookware, there are a lot of overwhelming options out there. And we may not always think about the fact that what we're using to cook with is just as important as what we eat. Because ingesting these chemicals through our cookware is definitely a route of exposure a lot of us are surprised by. And I'm no exception when I first started out. And this exposure can occur through heating or leaching of the chemicals into the food while cooking, or through breathing in fumes as the cookware is being heated. And chemicals can also leach into the food if the cookware we're using is scratched or damaged. So again, I know that there's a lot of info to take in this episode, but I just like to explain why certain things should be avoided or at least have reduced exposure to, so that you can make your own educated decisions about what you want to avoid and when. So don't worry about taking notes. Just like last week's episode about hormone disruptors, I know that this is a lot, so don't worry, I have you covered. I'll have a downloadable cheat sheet summarizing all of this information for you on my website at slightlygreener.com/episode 6, along with a list of sources for all this info you're about to hear, some quick tips, and some brand names to be on the lookout for. But first, let's talk about what to avoid and why. And know that once we get past all of this info, which can seem like a lot, there are solutions. Let's stick with nonstick pans. And I know that this one is going to hurt a little bit. I'll just say that right now, because they're so convenient and they just scrub away clean so quickly. But unfortunately, that convenience comes at a cost. And that's because nonstick pans use a coating that can create toxic fumes when they're heated. And one of the names you're probably most familiar with is Teflon, which is the brand name that DuPont trademarked for its nonstick coating. But because not all nonstick coating is necessarily Teflon, that brand name, I'll just stick to calling it nonstick. And one of the main problems with nonstick coating is that it uses PFAs, which is short for per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, or perfluorinated chemicals, which have been making the news lately, also known as forever chemicals. And they're called forever chemicals because they are persistent in the environment and in the body, and studies have shown that approximately 98% of people have levels of PFAs in their body. And these are the chemicals that make items waterproof and stain resistant or grease resistant, like in food packaging, and that makes cookware nonstick. So one perfluorinated chemical in particular has commonly been used as a component of nonstick coating, which is PFOA, which is short for perfluorooctanoic acid. And yes, I did practice these words. After this section, we don't have any more big ones. Don't worry about knowing these huge words. I just like to say them for the people who do like to know what PFOA and some of these terms stand for. So this chemical is also known as C8, which means that it has 8 carbon atoms in its chemical structure. So that means it's considered to be long chain, meaning that it's harder to break down in the environment, and part of the reason why it's so persistent. And PFOA has been linked to a variety of different health problems, things like cancer and hormone disruption, immune system issues, developmental problems, liver damage, and thyroid disease. So because of these health effects, PFOA, or C8, was phased out in 2013. But in some nonstick coatings, it has been replaced by perfluorohexanoic acid, which sounds a little similar, which is known as C6, which is suspected of having similar health effects. So C6 has 6 carbon atoms in its chemical structure, so that's considered to be a short chain perfluorinated chemical, which is thought to break down faster in the environment, meaning it may not be as persistent. But again, it has many of the same health concerns so far. And Teflon today uses PTFE, which is polytetrafluoroethylene, in place of PFOA. And PTFE belongs to a subgroup of PFAs called fluorinated polymers. But according to tests that were commissioned by the Environmental Working Group, in as little as 2 minutes on the stovetop, quote, cookware coated with Teflon and other nonstick surfaces can exceed temperatures at which the coating breaks apart and emits toxic particles and gases linked to hundreds, perhaps thousands, of pet bird deaths and an unknown number of human illnesses each year. While PTFE is considered to be relatively inert and non-toxic, you can see that there are still concerns about the potential harmful effects of PTFE and its byproducts under certain conditions. So when PTFE is heated to high temperatures, like in cooking, it can release toxic fumes and particles that can be harmful. And these effects are commonly known as Teflon flu or PTFE toxicosis, especially in birds, but it can also be harmful to humans too, causing flu-like symptoms like headache, fever, and chills, and it can also cause respiratory problems such as asthma, bronchitis, or even pneumonia. So when you preheat a pan or turn a burner on high heat, it's possible that harmful toxins are getting emitted into the air. And even if you do keep the temperature lower and at a safer level, the chemicals can still leach over time due to wear and tear or if the pan gets scratched or damaged. And this PTFE also doesn't break down easily, meaning that it is persistent in the environment and not very environmentally friendly. I'll talk later in this episode about how to replace pans and how I recommend doing it in stages. But to start off with, if you're still going to be using some of your nonstick pans that you can't bear to part with, there are a couple of things that you can do to make them safer. So don't preheat empty pans because the high temperature can cause these harmful gases to be released. And always make sure that you use non-scratch utensils so that you don't damage or scratch the cookware, which again can release more of those fumes and actually leach some of those chemicals into the foods as you're cooking them. Okay, that was a lot of info, so thanks for sticking with me on that. That's the longest section, but so many people use nonstick that I felt like I had to add a lot of info there so that you can make an educated decision. So there's no more long names, no more of that. Let's go on to the next one that I recommend avoiding, and that is aluminum cookware. And I recommend steering clear of aluminum because studies have shown that aluminum from cookware can leach into foods. Although the amount of aluminum that leaches into food is usually considered to be a small amount, some research suggests that over time, exposure to even small amounts of aluminum may be linked to health issues such as Alzheimer's disease or other neurodegenerative diseases. And a study that was published in the journal Toxicology Research showed that cooking with aluminum pots could lead to the leaching of heavy metals into food and pose mutagenic and genotoxic risks to consumers, meaning that they have the potential to damage DNA. For this study, researchers boiled water in 3 different aluminum pots by the same brand, but one was 6 years old, one was 3 years old, and one was new. And they found cadmium, copper, arsenic, nickel, lead, and aluminum were present in all of the test water samples. And they were at concentrations that were higher than the maximum limit allowable by regulatory standards. And the 6-year-old aluminum pot had the highest toxicity risk, followed by the 3-year aluminum pot. And the findings of the study found that cooking with aluminum pots could lead to the leaching of heavy metals into food, which does pose health risks. And aluminum is also a reactive metal, so that means that it can react with acidic foods like tomatoes, vinegar, and citrus juices. So that can cause the cookware to discolor, which can also cause a metallic taste to food because of the increased aluminum that was released and then absorbed by the food. And the longer the food is heated or stored in aluminum pans, the more aluminum that is absorbed. So make sure that when you are cooking that you don't store foods in these pots and pans, and make sure that you remove them from heat as soon as possible. All right, so those are the 2 main categories I wanted to talk about as far as cookware to avoid, because there are a couple of the common ones. But now we can get into the fun stuff and talk about safer solutions. But again, I need to preface it by saying that there's not necessarily one type of safer cookware that fits all. It typically depends on the food you're cooking, the cooking time, and the temperature you'll be cooking at, And it also depends a little bit on some health conditions you may have. All right, so the first one we'll talk about is cast iron. And this is a good option because it stays hot longer and the seasoning on cast iron pans makes it naturally nonstick if it's kept intact. And it's durable, which means it can potentially last for years if taken care of correctly. It's also easy to clean and it holds heat well. And if you've ever made a chocolate chip cookie in a cast iron pan or cornbread, you know what I'm talking about. They are great for baking. But one health benefit of cast iron can also be the drawback, because cooking with cast iron can leach small amounts of iron into food. And this can be a good thing if you need more iron in your diet. But if you already have high levels, or if you have a health condition such as hemochromatosis, which is an overload of iron, you may want to avoid using cast iron cookware. So for that reason, it's best used for sauteing vegetables and for baking. And this is another one that should not be used for cooking acidic foods, such as tomatoes or lemon or lime juice, because the acidity of these foods can, again, break down the seasoning in the pan, which can leach more iron into food. And like with the others too, a longer cooking time also increase the absorption of iron into food. So if you can, avoid cooking foods in cast iron that require a longer cooking time. So one of the things that makes it naturally nonstick is the seasoning. So to keep cast iron naturally nonstick, season it after each use and look at the manufacturer's instructions for how to season your pans and how often. And then make sure to not scrub with anything that's abrasive, and just use the recommended cleaning and scrubbing instructions that the manufacturer recommends. And this should make the cookware last for years. And one more drawback real quick to cast iron is the weight. They can be pretty heavy, which makes it not a great option sometimes. So a good alternative to that is to cast iron without the weight is carbon steel. So this has similar features in that it needs to be seasoned, which makes it naturally nonstick if it's seasoned correctly. And it holds high heat well, just like cast iron does too. And cooking acidic foods should be avoided again because of the potential of leaching iron into the food, as well as damaging the seasoned coating. But carbon steel really combines the best qualities of cast iron with stainless steel, which we'll talk about next, minus the heavy weight, which actually makes it a better option for some people. So with that being said, let's move on to stainless steel. And this is it's a safer option and can typically withstand higher heat than nonstick pans. But again, there are some concerns about chemicals leaching into foods. The reason for that is that stainless steel contains metals like nickel and chromium in its composition also. The part that makes it stainless is the addition of chromium. And the addition of nickel improves the performance and the durability, which are two of the reasons that make it a popular choice for cooking. But under certain circumstances, the nickel can leach into the food, especially, again, with that high acidity level like tomatoes, wine, or citrus juices, which is a concern for some people who have a nickel sensitivity. So if you do have a nickel sensitivity or an allergy is a concern, this may not be the best option for cookware. But in certain circumstances, the nickel can leach into the food, especially, again, with those high acid foods like tomatoes, wine, or citrus juices, which is a concern for people who have a nickel sensitivity. So if you have a health condition like nickel sensitivity or a nickel allergy, then this may not be the best option for cookware. But again, if you're not cooking foods high in acid, or if you have a lower cook time, it may be an okay option. But also make sure that you don't use stainless steel when it's damaged or scratched, because just like with the other cookware, that can increase the levels of nickel that is released and that is absorbed by the food. So one of the things that you can do to be on the safer side is to look on the bottom of a stainless steel pan, and you'll see one number / another number. And that first number is the chromium, followed by the nickel content. So ideally, you'll want to look for 18/8 or 18/0, because that second number represents the percentage of nickel, and the 8 and the 0 indicate the lowest percentage of nickel possible. One thing in common that you've seen or heard actually in these safer cookware options is that cooking acidic foods like tomatoes and vinegar and wine and citrus juices can break down the surfaces of cookware and increase the amount of chemicals that are leached into foods. So you may be wondering, what can I do then? And there is a great solution, and it's tempered glass. It's a great, safer alternative, and cracking should not be a concern unless it's being exposed to extremely high cooking temperatures. And it's easy to find things like loaf pans and casserole dishes made out of glass. And you can also look for certain pots and pans that are available in glass also. So if you are cooking with anything like tomatoes or tomato sauce, glass is a great option. There is one more type of cookware that I'd like to mention that has gained popularity over the past few years, and that is ceramic. There are some popular ceramic brands out there, but due to not knowing exactly what that coating is, they might be an okay alternative to traditional nonstick pots and pans, but I would not consider it to be the best non-toxic option. There's also a lawsuit that was brought against one of the cookware companies for making claims about their coating being non-toxic when it did potentially contain some chemicals that are considered to be toxic. There's two different types of ceramic cookware. There's pure ceramic cookware, and then there's cookware that is covered with a ceramic-like coating. So if you do choose to use ceramic, look for the pure ceramic cookware. Ceramic covered cookware is made with polymer materials that look like ceramic, but the only pure ceramic option has less chance of leaching heavy metals. And there are a couple brands that do conduct third-party testing that have come back with good results. But the problem is a lot of these times, these pans don't last as long as regular cookware, and they break down pretty quickly. So it's for that reason that really I would not recommend one of these options, and I would choose one of the other safer options instead. So that's pretty much it for safer options. So I know we went over a lot today, so I'll give you a quick summary right now. So nonstick cookware could contain harmful chemicals, and the newer coatings that have replaced the ones previously banned still have health concerns. And nonstick cookware that is over 10 years old should be disposed of safely because it most likely contains PFOA, which was phased out in 2013. And I'll just add a little side note here too. When you're looking for new pots and pans, be wary of the ones that say PFOA free because they probably still have some type of coating in there that uses some chemicals with similar health concerns. So it's also a little bit tricky because they don't make PFOA free or PFOA anymore. So PFOA free is a little bit misleading. Next, studies have shown that aluminum from cookware can leach aluminum into foods when it's being cooked, and aluminum is linked to Alzheimer's disease and other neurodegenerative diseases. And when it comes to safer options, cast iron is very durable and handles high temperatures well. It's naturally nonstick if the seasoning is kept intact, but because of the potential of leaching iron into the food, it's best for baking and sautéing vegetables. Avoid cooking acidic foods in cast iron. And stainless steel is another safe option, but it has nickel and chromium concerns when it comes to leaching. So don't use it when the cookware is scratched or damaged, or with high acid foods like tomatoes and wine and all that good stuff. It can withstand higher heat than nonstick pans, which is another benefit. And look for the numbers on the bottom of the cookware. And again, you want to look for something ideally that says 18/8 or 18/0. And remember that glass is a good option for cooking these foods like the acidic ones, the tomato sauces, tomatoes, wine, and citrus juices that we've been told to avoid with all the other ones. So keeping some glass bakeware and some pots and pans is a good option also. And I know that it can be expensive to replace cookware. I went through it, a couple times now. So these are the steps I recommend. So rather than dumping all your cookware and having to replace it all at the same time, which can be super expensive, I like to recommend doing it in stages. So the first thing I would do is I would start by getting rid of the nonstick cookware that is scratched, or if the lining has begun chipping or flaking, because again, this can cause leaching of chemicals into foods. And I would also suggest getting rid of old pans that you suspect might be 10 years old or older, because again, those could contain the nonstick coatings that would contain PFOA. And I won't go into all the details here for time's sake, but make sure when you're disposing of these pots and pans that you do it safely. Because of the chemicals, they shouldn't just be thrown away where they end up in a landfill. So I'm not going to go into all of the safe disposing tips here just for time's sake, but you can find it on my website. I'll give you some of the tips in that cheat sheet also. And again, that's at slightlygreener.com/episode 6. You can also Google safe ways to dispose of nonstick cookware, things like that, or stainless steel if it's damaged. So you can look that up because every area is also different. And then there's TerraCycle too. But again, I won't go into all the details, but look for that on the cheat sheet. So once you've replaced your damaged and your old cookware first, when you're ready, it's time to move on. So here's where the choose your top 2 rule comes in again. So if you can choose your top 1 or 2 most used nonstick or, not safe pots and pans or cookie sheets or muffin tins, whatever it is, replace the ones that you use the most first and then work your way up from there. And then there are some overall safety tips for basically any of these pans because once they become scratched or damaged, then more chemicals can be released and be absorbed into the food. So don't preheat pans without food or liquid in them. Cook at a lower heat, especially if using nonstick pans. Don't store food in pans, especially acidic foods. Replace cookware that has visible scratches or damage. And when you're buying new cookware, avoid labels that say PFOA free because it may use another type of toxic nonstick coating. And that is it for this episode. Thank you so much for sticking with me. We went through a lot of information, and I really hope that all of this info helped. And don't forget to visit this show's page at slightlygreener.com/episode 6 for a downloadable cheat sheet with a quick breakdown of all of these tips and brand names to look for, as well as ways to safely dispose of worn down or scratched cookware. And I'm so happy you joined me today and can't thank you enough for sticking with it. I think after saying all those big words, I might go have a glass of wine right now because I am recording this at night. So that was a lot of big words for me after a long day. So happy, safer cooking, and I will see you in the next episode. Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of the Slightly Greener Life podcast. Please take a moment to subscribe to the show, and then be sure to share it with a friend who you know wants simple steps to living in this complex world. I'll see you next time.